Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week, Scott and I talked about how the concept of human evolution is not as simple as many people think. Sure, there are some people who are entirely against any conception of human evolution, but a lot of other people, basically all non-believers and roughly half of Christian believers alike, can fully accept the, now standard scientific model of humans arising through common descent from an ancestor we share in common with chimps and Neanderthals. But that's not a homogeneous group, the camp, my camp, of people who accept the idea of human evolution. There are many dimensions to that evolution, and many people in our camp may not have thought their way completely through this claim of humans evolving upward, climbing up the evolutionary ladder in all respects. We talked about the members of our camp crossing a series of lines in the sand, and how they have no problem crossing the first two lines that represent human evolution when it comes to our biology, in other words, our bodies, as well as cognitively, the evolution of our minds and our thinking and our technology. But then there's another line, a third one, which represents humans evolving upwards in a spiritual and religious sense. This one is a little harder for some members of our camp to cross, especially the ones who hold a Christian worldview. And then there's a fourth line in the sand, which represents the evolution of human morality and ethics, humans climbing upward in that sense too. And for many members in our camp, that's a line they have trouble crossing. Not just the Christians and theists, but also atheists. And when they push back on that idea, they always tend to point to our murderous streak. How humans are always killing each other, inventing new ways to kill each other, and on that criterion alone deny that we've been evolving upward in our morality. But I disagree. Not only do I think that humans have been climbing up the evolutionary ladder in the moral and ethical sense, but the theist in me says this is part of the divine plan. And both the theist in me and the skeptical agnostic in me both say this upward evolution in our technology and in our morality imposes a responsibility on us humans to learn to get along and to take care of the planet. To unpack those claims, we're going to be covering a huge swath of human history, at least 5,000 years worth, including those parts of our history that saw humans migrating out of Africa and passing through that part of the world that joins Africa to Europe and Asia, at precisely the time that we were unpacking that religious streak that we had evolved in Africa, which is in part why that's where we find some of the world's oldest religions, the Egyptian religion, the Jewish religion, and the Zoroastrian religion. But getting an expert on all of this human history was going to be difficult. The first few thousand years of that history would require an anthropologist, someone who studies bones and artifacts, while the middle part of it requires an expert in the ancient Near East, an Indiana Jones type of character. And then the millennium before Christ and the 2 millennia after Christ would each require a different historian. And then probably an additional historian / sociologist / ethicist to cover the most recent century or two, given the tremendous amount of change that we've seen in society in the past few centuries. So rather than trying to line up all those scholars and creating a whole mini-series of episodes, which I'm sure would exhaust even the most dedicated of our listeners, I thought we should get someone with an informed perspective on that part of human history which saw a sudden upward deflection in human morality and ethics. Scott and I shared with our listeners what we learned about an amazing period in human history when human intellectual activity suddenly just took off into the stratosphere. A period which historians refer to as the axial period, when a variety of people groups in the ancient Near East, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, Persians, Assyrians, and Greeks, ancient tribal Greeks, got busy unpacking all kinds of abstract ideas, and then suddenly, out of this cultural incubator, Greek philosophy and science exploded onto the human stage in the ancient Near East. And the same kind of thing was happening in the Far East. A variety of people groups in what we now call India, Nepal, and China were busy developing their own ancient tribal religions, and then suddenly out of those cultural incubators we see Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, and Taoism. That covers a lot of expertise, and it would involve too many scholars, but we found the search for an expert got a lot easier when we leveraged the fact that one of the greatest outputs of this axial age was the Hebrew Bible itself. So I started scouring that part of my database and I found an excellent candidate. Dr. Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson holds the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein Dean's Chair at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and is the Vice President of American Jewish University in Los Angeles, California. He's a professor in the Department of Philosophy and is rabbinically trained and is particularly interested in theology, ethics, and the integration of science and religion. He's a frequent contributor for the Huffington Post and the Times of Israel, and is the author of 12 books and over 250 scholarly articles. He has long been a passionate advocate for social justice, human dignity, diversity, and inclusion. So altogether, he's supremely qualified to speak on this topic. Dr. Rabbi Artson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Luke. And please feel free to call me Brad.
I will try hard not to defer to the more polite.
Did you grow up in LA or?
I grew up in San Francisco.
Okay.
Went to college on the East Coast and rabbinical seminary on the East Coast.
Okay.
In the United States, and then came back to Southern California where I had a congregation for 10 years.
Oh, very good.
And took over rabbinical school.
You just came back from Germany, I understand. You were ordaining.
I did. I'm also the dean of rabbinical school in Berlin and Potsdam. So we ordained 2 Europeans as rabbis and then went to London for a conference, a denominational conference for the continent.
And what kind of synagogue were you a rabbi in, like Reformed or
Conservative?
Conservative, okay. So is that the school of thought that you would yourself is?
So I was ordained in a conservative rabbinical school, and I now am the dean of a conservative rabbinical school. But I feel pretty strongly that in our time, denominations pertain more to institutions than to individuals, and that people need to be able to take wisdom wherever they find it, as Maimonides taught. So I'm happy to have teachers from all of the different streams of Jewish and indeed human life. To the extent that a person is defined by a denomination, I'm a rabbi within the conservative denomination, but I actually think that these days that doesn't work so well.
Yeah, well, I I feel you, because as someone who has an evangelical background, I can certainly understand where you're coming from.
There's a rabbi of the previous generation who quipped that your denomination is the one that you're most ashamed of.
That's good. That's good. I like that.
Now, in addition to your expertise in morality, ethics, and theology, we became particularly interested in talking with you when we learned that one of your scholarly interests includes process theology, the idea that God also changes with time. And for some people, this is a fairly new and provocative idea, which Christians have been exploring fairly recently, but you'll be coming at this with a very Jewish perspective. And so we're really looking forward to that part of our conversation near the end.
Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen, we need to dive right in because we're covering a very big topic spread out over a very long time span. Let's first start with the prehistory, roughly 10 or 50,000 years ago. We don't have anything written down from that time, but we do have a reasonably good idea of what life was like for humans at that time. Before we were Neolithic farmers settling in large cities in the Levant of the ancient Near East, we were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. Bands of family clans, roughly 20 to 50 in number, always on the move to find new sources of food. And sociologists have learned a lot about hunter-gatherer societies all through human history. Those societies consistently have a very might makes right kind of mentality. Males are dominant, females subservient. The strong control the weak. The alpha male can say and do anything. And there's typically a fear or a suspicion or even a hatred of anyone outside the small clan. Intruders and strangers risk being killed on sight, often simply because they represent competition for limited food resources. So, Brad, is it fair to say that their sense of morality and ethics was non-existent?
So I'm sorry to disagree from the outset.
Oh, wow, interesting.
No.
I think that people consistently overestimate the morality of their own time and undervalue the morality of previous ages. So we don't actually know much about those early societies. We have physical remains of some of their tools and implements, but we don't know that what you said is actually true. It's not like there are records from the times. And if we look at primate culture, it's much more complicated than that. The large apes have a very defined morality system. Anyone who's lived with a dog or a cat knows that they already have empathy and consideration for others, others not of their own species, not just of people. So let me lay one piece of evidence out for you. There's a wonderful burial place that was uncovered in which a mother was found buried with her twin children, and they were wrapped, placed on a bed of flowers, and they were wrapped embracing each other. So the two children facing the mother and their arms intertwined.
Hmm.
That says a lot about the society that they lived in, that this was a society that loved people beyond death. This is a society that thought that women and children had value and could be honored posthumously. This was a society that was based on a lot of love. Now, it's true that their technology was more simple, and they may have been less verbally sophisticated than we are, but I think it's a mistake to think that morality is an outgrowth of rationality. It is not. It's not the product of logic, it's the product of empathy. And to assume, I don't mean to brag, but I did one of those genetic tests and I'm 3% Neanderthal, which you can tell from my sloping forehead and my prominent chin. Um, but, my people have been caring for each other for a long, long time. And I think we need to not confuse technological simplicity with a lack of empathy or compassion or care.
Hmm.
Right. And correct. I agreed. I had already said that we don't have anything written from that period, but we extrapolate from what we know about hunter-gatherer societies existent today and in history. And I would have thought based on that, we just find that they are prone to kill outsiders. There's a very strong suspicion of the other, which I then see as why we today have racism. We just have always been suspicious of the other. And there was no hesitation to steal a resource if you were hungry and somebody else had food, I would have thought.
That sounds to me like a description of today's newspaper.
Okay.
Right?
And
There is an illusion of moral development. And it's true, it's nuanced and it's changed. And we will talk about the ways morality has shifted over time. But I think we need to be cautious in a place of no evidence. It turns out much of what we think we know about hunter-gatherer cultures are just our own bias for our own culture. We measure them by our criteria.
right.
So I'll just remind you that more people are enslaved today than at any point in human history, and more people have died in war in the last 100 years than in all the previous wars. So it's hard for me to hear living people criticizing the dead for a lack of
Right.
morality.
Hmm.
And to put my cards on the table, one of the points I'm going to make is I agree that we have not changed when it comes to murdering and stealing and a variety of other things that we would now describe as immoral. We do that just as much as before. But what I'm going to hopefully find and show is that we have other things in our morality that we've added to our morality, that we
For sure.
are
For
more
sure.
compassionate now.
We have created correctives and we have the
Right.
insight of an empirical approach. I mean, there's a lot of things that have changed, including the heritage of religion, which is, you'll admit, a fairly mixed legacy, but with great potential. So I
Right.
don't mean to say nothing has changed, but I don't see this as a straight evolutionary line towards progress.
Okay, interesting. Let's see how it what we have to say near the end of this episode. But maybe we should now move on. Unless did either of you have more to say about that period of our history, the prehistory of our journey?
I would just echo pretty similar concerns in our own discussions, Luke. I have expressed that, when we're talking about the prehistory, we're on very thin ice as far as evidence
Right.
and that kind of stuff, right? And I just, when I listen to paleoanthropologists and people like that, it's fascinating to me, but I think to myself, wow, there's a lot of speculation going on here, and there's probably a lot of hidden bias going on as well. I mean, let's face it, Europeans saw anybody living a quote hunter-gatherer lifestyle as savages,
Right.
and as uncivilized and so on. And that probably still sneaks in, even though it's, we consciously wouldn't do that now. But I think we still tend to look at societies like that as somehow inferior,
Yes.
to our own.
Okay, so then let's move forward to that period in time when humans first started to record history, roughly around 3000 or 2000 BCE. Again, this would include the ancient Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, Egyptians in the ancient Near East, and the Chinese and Vedic peoples of Asia in the Far East. What evidence do we have in their writings and artifacts about their morality and ethics? Was it much different from what we describe for our prehistoric hunter-gatherer ancestors?
So there was an outburst. Once people came up with symbolic ways of replicating sound, which happened in the Middle East and in China separately, but quite early on, then that allowed for people to retain memory, and it allowed for people to create works of imagination and to project ideals and to, their ideas of how the universe works and how divinity works and all of that. And one of the things that strikes me today is that the Bible is unique, not so much in its theological approach, but it is, to my mind, the only work out of this period in which the divine speaks to common people. And that can't be overstated. If you look at Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which come from about the same time as the prophets of Israel, there's not a single commoner who ever says a word, not a word in the Iliad or the Odyssey. Even the slaves who speak are kidnapped royals. Because the idea that Zeus or Athena would care about what a common Greek would think was inconceivable. And you don't find that in Egyptian literature, Babylonian, Akkadian, like none of them. And so it does make me ask, where did the Hebrew Bible come up with this utterly unprecedented idea that the God of the universe speaks to slaves and redeems slaves not through a royal household, but through a common Israelite household? And that when God picks prophets to speak, those prophets don't have pedigree. They're not nobility. In fact, nobility is portrayed somewhat badly as corrupted by power or by wealth. And it's not like you can, again, apply an evolutionary trajectory to this. It's not that there were some texts that had that a little and then some texts that had it more and then ta-da, Isaiah. It was that Moses did it out of the blue and unique to ancient, which is why I think ancient cultures didn't know what to do with Israelite culture, because it was just off the charts for them and nuts. It was just nuts. Right? But I do think that's the gift of that period of time. Was the ability of writing allowed people to become purveyors of value. And it allowed cultures to record those values, and that erupted in something frankly discontinuous. There's another way in which the Israelite culture is discontinuous. And ironically, I think people pick the wrong thing when they pick the number of deities. That's there are examples of monolatry in the ancient world too.
Monolatry is the worship of one god without denying the existence of other gods, which is very different from monotheism, which says there is only one God.
I don't think whether it's 1 or 3 or 10 is such a big deal. But what is also a big deal in the Hebrew Bible is that the only time that capital punishment is applied is when a human life is lost. And you never, ever, ever execute someone for a property crime, which is the opposite in Egyptian law or Babylonian law. In those cultures, the punishment is very much has to do with the class of the individual. And also, if you took property, you get killed. But somehow that transvaluation, the assertion that God speaks to common people and cares about common people, and that means that salvation belongs to the common people, not just the prerogative of the pharaohs, also plays out in the legal system, in which the law is designed to preserve human dignity and human life in a classless way. That, again, unprecedented, but that speaks, Luke, to the morality you're talking about. But again, it's what's striking to me is that it's discontinuous.
Right.
Would you agree that that is ultimately rooted in the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God that's established right in the first few verses of Genesis? The idea that...
Well, so here the critical scholar in me, speaking from my friend Richard Elliott Friedman too, those of us who believe that the Bible was both given by God but mediated through human beings,
right,
would argue that the evidence suggests that the book of Genesis isn't earlier than the later books. It gets posited in that value, but I don't think that's what created the value. The value existed, and then the Bible gets laid out it gets percolated through that value system, and then the way it percolates dynamically then reinforces and changes. So there's a kind of biofeedback involved. In the
Yeah.
exploitation of the value continues to shape the value, and that goes on to this very day.
Right. So yeah, so it's like the origin story needs to fit with the values that already existed. Yeah.
Well,
And reinforce them.
correct. And then it also changed each value, each generation, because of the values that it gets from its life experience and from the text, and reads the story slightly differently than the generation before it. And that keeps the cycle going.
Right.
But I do think it's the Bible's insistence that everybody is made in God's image is one of the most subversive and powerful convictions that ever exploded on the human scene. We still haven't lived up to its implications.
So I agree with you 100% on how you've distinguished the ancient Hebrews at that time. But I would like to make the 2 points, I'd like to separate them out, the 2 points that I was trying to make. First of all, that everybody else, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, they still had this very extremely might makes right way of thinking. They still
Yes.
were very quick to murder, that sort of thing.
Right, but Luke, I guess what I want to say to you is it's not clear that that's something they inherited from the hunter-gatherers. That might have been a product of the urbanization, which required a hierarchy that hadn't been necessary among more rural communities.
Right. And we did talk about that in an episode a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Chris Berger. He was telling us about the various cognitive changes that had to happen in humans when they went from these small bands of 20 to 50 hunter-gatherers to settled cities of thousands and tens of thousands.
Yeah.
But, okay, yes, there is a discontinuity with the Hebrew society, the Hebrew culture, but otherwise everybody is still very much holding values that we would not espouse. But then there's also additional values that everybody, including the Hebrews, still worked with. So, for example, women were still secondary, slavery, various things like that. So there's still I would describe it as do I call it a lesser morality? I don't know.
Well, so the question I would ask you, Luke, is I'm struck by the fact that anti-slavery didn't start until there were machines that could do slave labor. In other words, you need a material culture that allows you to think, I don't have to be doing this anymore.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson knew that slavery was evil. He just couldn't see getting rid of his slaves.
You know, that's a really fascinating point. I have wondered about this, and I'm not a scholar in the area, so I don't know, but I have wondered for many years, why did technology not advance in the ancient world? These civilizations that existed, for example, Egypt for 3,000 years, but they never advanced beyond a certain point. And I believe a good part of that is slavery. They didn't need to have running water because they had people who would run for water. You know, you know what I mean? Do you think there's any validity to that?
I don't know which comes first. Some ancient cultures did have running water.
I know. Yeah, I know.
Pumped water, but running water. But I guess I do want to say that every age looks with horror on its predecessors and wonders why they don't get the obvious, you know, and I do think that is true. And I also want to say the challenge for ancient Israel, because I'm not certainly claiming that ancient Israel lived up to its moral potential. In fact, what's astonishing about the Hebrew Bible in its entirety is it's the most self-critical book of its own. Everyone else's religious book talks about how its community is a community of saints, and then is the outsiders as the bad ones. And the Hebrew Bible is like, just keeps carrying on about how atrocious the Hebrews are, as it figures someone else is taking care of everybody else's shortcomings. So the struggle of ancient Israel is knowing what the ideal standards are, you nonetheless keep relapsing into the patterns of the nations around you. And in fact, that's why they ask for a king, remember? Right? They want a king to be like the peoples around them. So the idea of leaning into not being like the Canaanites, that's what the prophets keep having to yell at them for.
Okay, so we are going through this quickly because we are trying to cover a lot of ground. Let's move now to the axial age. Scott and I described that briefly to our listeners last week. This is the period in human history where we see the rise and fall of, in air quotes, global empires, the Neo-Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Chinese empires, and the appearance of world-changing philosophical and religious traditions. So in the Middle East, in Greece and China and India, and I'm talking here about Hellenic Greek philosophy, the Hebrew scriptures, Buddha in Nepal, Confucius in China. What impact did these have on the human morality and ethics at that time, roughly around 500 BCE?
Well, it is an astonishing and complicated phenomenon. And I know there are historians who dismiss it entirely as a kind of Western construal, but it is remarkable that within this 200-year period in ancient Israel, in the Middle East, in the Far East, there are these thinkers who take an inherited tradition and pivot it in a way that suddenly makes room for the inner life, for the individual as a part of community, and integrates the pursuit of communal justice as part of the religious agenda. And those are big ticket items. Like those, you can see them as contained within what existed prior, but it was made much more explicit and much more visible and was deeply unpopular, which is how you know it was a change. Like prophets never got invited over for dinner parties. They were not popular people, nor was the Buddha. But there is nonetheless a sense of something exciting and new that with time speaks to a lot of people. But here I want to also highlight, it's not that the old religions die or freeze, right? Hinduism is profoundly shaped by Buddhist cultural values and practices. In fact, the Western notion of kind of bordered religions doesn't really work very well in describing India or China. And in the West as well, those other, like Egypt gets Hellenized too. So what people do throughout time is they revisit the culture they inherit through their own eyes, and they won't allow for a significant gap. So they reinterpret it, sometimes not knowing that's what they're doing. Right? You know, in America today, most Christians assume that loving Judaism is the natural Christian default, which would have been a shock to any Christian in the 1400s.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Unfortunately,
Well,
yes.
but I'm saying we all do this. We all read books through our own eyes.
Yeah.
Without intending to, we can't help but interpret it in ways that are consistent with our own worldview.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that within Christian history, as soon as Christianity started to spread beyond the Jewish people, which was pretty early, fairly early, all of a sudden they're accommodating it to, guess what, Hellenism and Greek ideas and Platonic ideas and so on and so forth. And so just to what you're saying, it goes.
And that's not just, the
no,
that as well, the Muslim religion. But what's also true, and I think it gets to what Luke is talking about moral development. The story of the Buddha is of someone who was of the empire and who rejected it. And the Hebrew prophets are people who are critiquing the kings and the institutions. There's a kind of anti-institutionalism that's part of the axial age. And then the tension that gets played out in religions around the world is to succeed, you need to get in bed with empire. Christianity could have chosen Jerusalem, but it chose Rome. And that has been, I think, the central fault line of Christianity through the ages, is we really, really, really want to be the official religion of the West, but to do that, we have to accommodate power.
Yeah,
and that's so, to this outsider reading the words of Jesus, that feels so incompatible with the guy who was sleeping in fields and critiquing the powers. But that choice was made again by Islam, and it was made by anyone who had the option to do it. Yes. The only thing that saved medieval Judaism from that dilemma was nobody was willing to talk to us. So that preserved our anti-empire stance, mostly because we were waiting to be invited in. But I do think that's a human propensity, and the axial age offers us a path not taken. That religious thriving cannot be accommodating to human avarice, human domination, human power. Right. It has to be a way in which we are always outsiders.
So we're getting ahead of ourselves, gentlemen. All this talk of Islam and Rome and empires, that's going to be in the next period that I want to talk about. But let's finish a couple more points here with the Axial Age. There was a lot of amazing advances in philosophy, in morality. It's just an amazing period. But it's important to emphasize what we don't see happening in this period of our history, the Axial Age. We don't have anti-war protests. It's a very warring society. The time where there's a lot of warring between empires, between countries, and we don't have any anti-war protests. We don't have any vocal public oppositions to any injustices. We still see a lot of inequalities. Human slavery was quite accepted during the time of the Romans. Even Judaism and Christianity had scriptural guidelines which prescribed a more humane treatment of slaves rather than prohibiting slavery completely.
Not to mention the treatment of women.
Right.
So, it didn't occur to anybody in any of these cultures to say that the subordination of women is in itself an erasing of human dignity. So yes, that's true. So part of what is shocking, it is said that visiting the past is like visiting a foreign country, right? And it's true. You go back in the past and there's a whole bunch of things we would like them to say, but that reflects a 21st century, like our perspective. And you can't ask from that age that it do that. You can ask, what has it done relative to what it inherited? Has it expanded the franchise? Has it lifted the level of human discourse and human concern? And it is true that during this period, there is a sense of what does it mean to conduct war justly? And what makes the cause of a war a just war? Like these are people starting to talk about those things. You get Socrates, who is radically decertifying human knowledge. You think you know stuff, but you don't. You get the prophet Isaiah saying, all these sacrifices we're making are great if you're behaving towards the widow and the orphan a certain way, but if not, it's despicable. So there's a whole lot of decertification going on across these cultures, but only within the context of what they could bear, what they could notice.
So then let's now move into the Common Era. We had already begun to put our feet across that line, but let's now talk about that. The most recent 2,000 years of human history, beginning with the years 0 to 500 CE, when we had the Roman Empire building and maintaining roads and seaports, which facilitated the spread of all these religious and moral and ethical ideas around the world, the known world at that time, bringing Christianity and Judaism to all parts of Europe and Asia, and eventually into other continents on the globe. Islam is birthed at this time, and likewise Buddhism spreads out from its own birthplace in Nepal, and Hinduism and Confucianism and Taoism from China. All kinds of religions being birthed and spreading around, mingling and comparing notes, each developing new forms of morality and ethics, which eventually influence the governments and the sovereigns of the many nations that arise and the laws that each of these create. So what can we now say about human morality and ethics during this extended period relative to what it was like 5,000 years before?
Well, the first thing to say is that we can't make generalizations around the world. Human culture is very distinct. Europe goes into a medieval period that is marked, among other things, by a decline in population, a decline in material culture, and the rise of the two monotheisms warring at each other, each expecting complete victory, and then a third little tiny monotheism in between trying to be ignored.
Trying to survive.
Yes. So what's going on in Europe is very different. And here I want to highlight that I think the difference is actually that this is during the period in the ancient world, Europe had access to the whole world, right? Roman ships could travel everywhere. And Africa and Asia were cut off from the world. But during this medieval period, North Africa gets access to the world and Europe is shut in on itself. So one of the lessons I get from this period is it's never good to be isolated. That in a sense, the end of the medieval period was when the Europeans invented boats that could travel around the Islamic Empire and get access to Africa and Asia. And incidentally, there's another continent out there. So that kind of human interaction with the world is itself a good. That's one of the things I take out of that period.
Yeah, and in alignment with what you're saying, physical travel and trading goods and so on, but also knowledge, right? All of a sudden, there's contact with Islam and the knowledge of Persia and Persian and Islamic math and things like that, and then Aristotle is rediscovered, those kind of things. All of that creates a dialogue that ends up in the Renaissance, I guess.
Yes,
Ultimately.
but it ends up also breaking the medieval period. Right?
Yes.
So I do think you have to acknowledge, the medieval period was a remarkable period. It was more dynamic than moderns like to give it credit for.
Hmm, hmm.
And also, no one would choose to live then,
Yeah.
right? Like it was a very violent time. And it also then disrupts the evolutionary narrative, right? Because it's not like the medieval period just made things better than the period before it. People pined for at least Roman order. It was bloodthirsty, but it meant the roads were safe,
Right.
Mhm.
right? And Europe was now a place where people are painting their butts blue with berry juice and killing each other. And, the Vikings are marauding all over Northern Europe in the hopes of becoming a television series in the 2000s. Um, right. But I look at those shows and what they realistically portray is an interesting mix, right? There's a weird kind of proto-feminism in Viking culture. They weren't egalitarian, but women could cut off people's heads with swords just like boys did. And there was a kind of sexual freedom that came with paganism that comes skirting close to modern choice-driven.
Mm,
And at the same time, it's utterly repugnant in its level of violence and its glorification of theft. All of that has to be conquered in a sense, right? So again, to me, it's not a story of a straight line advance. It's a story of something that's very fragile and something that can be disrupted very easily.
Again, you've underlined the points that I'm trying to make, that murder and killing is consistent all through our timeline. I'll agree that we'll see that even to today. We're going to come to the contemporary period, but I'm not denying that our murderous streak has been with us ever since the dawn of time. But this is now a time in our history where we see glimmers of hope, little rays of light coming out, and you've hinted at some of them. We're seeing at the popular level, the general people, this is a time when we start to see humanitarian efforts, collections being taken up to help out people who experienced a famine or some other natural disaster. We have examples of this in the New Testament. I'm sure you can quote other examples of this. This is also when hospitals and schools start being built, and there's a greater value and commitment being put on basic human dignity. Not long after this, we find general population standing up against inequality, equal rights
So
for what? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I have to jump in. There's a truth there, and also the language, I think, distorts it. Certainly, Christian charity looks like an advance, but I can tell you that my people were not on the receiving end of that,
Okay.
mm.
nor were Muslims.
Right.
And Islam also has an elaborate tradition of charitable support for the indigent that is
Hmm.
an advance of monotheism over alternatives, but it was only for the insiders. And a great deal of energy was put into putting down the outsiders, the dhimmi in Muslim culture and Jews and gypsies in Europe. So again, it's not a simple straight line. There are the glimmerings of things we want to emphasize, and we desperately want to turn history into narration, right? Stories have coherent points of organization,
Hmm.
but life seldom does.
Mhm.
So the line of Monty Python that, they'll never expect the Inquisition. The truth is, they didn't expect the Inquisition. Like nobody expected the expulsion from Spain. That was a last minute fluke of history. And so I want to resist turning this into the triumphal march of expanded freedom. Each and every generation had people who had to fight for it and who had to wrest history from those who were emphasizing other things that were embedded in the history.
I won't deny those points, but I'm maintaining that we're beginning to see some of these positive changes. And you're right, they were very much in-house changes and very handed out stingily, but we're beginning to see that. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. I want to come to that in the present day, that we're seeing more of that. But this is also the period where you were mentioning that it is very much an in-house, compassionate.
Well, Luke, can I just say one other thing? It's also nobody took from the, I don't know, the congregation of all believers that we should eliminate royalty or we should eliminate class or the idea that you have serfs and then the serfs do the work to support the feudal lords. Like nobody took being in the image of God. It was a kind of charity as pathetic, right? That kind of pity party in which, oh, you poor miserable soul, I will give you a coin. But nobody said, wait, the fact that you're sitting in a castle with tons of coins, that's the issue. Right? So that's in a way where modernity ruptures the story, right? That maintaining privilege and then within privilege expressing pity is actually a way of perpetuating privilege and disparity.
Right.
Yes. I wonder if a bit of a nuance in this discussion is that what you're describing in large part is the institutions of religion, right? Particularly in the middle and late Middle Ages, the Reformation and so on, the Catholic, Rome. However, in the area of maybe unintended consequences, like the Reformation comes along, and Luther's attitude toward the Jews, of course, is well known. And Luther does not advocate for the kind of liberal society that we now believe in. However, because he does advocate for certain things, the idea that people can think for themselves, the people that can read the Bible for themselves in their own language and stuff like that. Yeah, it launches these unintended. So then the Anabaptists and more radical reformers take those things, because there was resistance to institutions amongst certain groups, small groups, but they were heavily persecuted,
Yes, so agreed. Absolutely. And we need to highlight the stories that reflect our values, right? But we need to know that's what we're doing. We're not just reading the past, because the past has the Counter-Reformation. And frankly, even within the Reformation, talk to me about how Protestants treat native peoples. It's a not pretty story.
No, you're right. Yeah.
So we have to be able to say this wasn't unidirectional. Of course, each age offers tools for people who come to it with a liberatory mindset, right? And there are tools that this age unveils that we utilize now as well. But Luther was as much a conservative force, and it's what you do with it. Nazis were Lutheran.
Yeah.
I remember stories from congregants who were in the camps, who, the moment where they lost hope, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but this is to illustrate an older point. The moment they lost hope was on Sundays when they saw the Nazi guards dressing up and going into a building, and he asked his friend, what are they doing? And he said, they're going to church. And at that point, he gave, how in the world is that possible? They go in, they pray to the same God, they're singing the same psalms, and then they're going to come out and start killing us again. And up until then, he had just said, well, they're beasts. And then he said, no, they're not. They're monotheists. They're sophisticated. So there too, I want to resist making this a simple story. There are elements in Luther that can be utilized for human elevation and human dignity, but that still becomes an ongoing battle for those of us who've inherited this whole complicated mess.
Yeah, no, excellent point. Yeah.
So again, I am finding myself in agreement, and yet I do think it's important to emphasize what is changing.
You're allowed to do. I just have to tell you, there's a long and glorious crowd of people who don't agree with me, so do not hesitate to take their side.
Sure. I do want to emphasize, though, what is changing, what was not present 3,000 or 5,000 years ago. At this period that we're talking about, it's essentially now we're coming close to the contemporary. We have people standing up against inequality, equal rights for women.
Let me jump in and then say something from outside the Christian side of that story.
Okay.
So in this period is also the rise of the Marrano, right? So Spain, Portugal, many countries successfully forced Jews to choose between conversion or expulsion. And some of those converts were sincere. Let's even assume many. But some of them just didn't want to get kicked out.
Sure.
You start this process in which people tell their children in secret, we're Jewish, Don't tell anybody. If you grow up and decide you want to be Catholic, that's fine. And if you grow up and decide you want to be Jewish, that's fine too, but you have to keep it a secret. So you get these people going to church, and for the first time, they are evaluating what they're hearing based on whether it confirms their own belief, right? So Jews are sitting in the pews, and when the pastor gives a sermon based on the book of Psalms, they say, oh, that's really lovely. And then he tells a story about the resurrection, and they say, whatever. Um, and that proclivity of criticizing the doctrine within church, that has a huge role on both the Reformation and on modernity. Because modernity produces people like Spinoza who finally say, I don't need that. I don't need to go into that. Like, I don't agree with that building and what they're saying. I'm not going there anymore. And a key part of modernity was making that an option. So within Christianity, the rise of the Reformation produces people who think they can critique religious institutions. And Luther lived long enough to see people critiquing him,
Yes.
same grounds which he used against Catholics, and he was really offended. But that happened within rabbinic Judaism as well. Jews now trained by a generation or two of Marano living, then flee to Amsterdam. They go back into an Orthodox synagogue, but they're used to evaluating the sermon. And so all of a sudden, for the first time, they're saying, gee, what did you think about what the rabbi said today? Like, that's a modern question. You don't ask that question in 1200, but you sure do in 1600. So you start to get the beginnings of skepticism and of evaluation not based on doctrine. And that I want to hold out, Luke, as an advance of the period. That was something unprecedented from what had come before.
Agreed. And the point that I was trying to make, which is not taking away from yours, but I'd like to finish this one point, though, that we were talking earlier about how Christians were showing sympathy towards, generally speaking, other Christians, Muslims towards other Muslims, Buddhists towards Buddhists. And that is true. But we see changes in that as time goes on. We see people now standing up against inequalities in all ways, people of other races, other sexual persuasions, for other religions, a greater tolerance for people with equal rights, having all these other qualities, standing up against slavery. This is the movement just a few hundred years ago where the general population stood up against these inequalities and the slavery. The protests beginning to come against war and various injustices. These are things that just were not present thousands of years ago.
But the only thing, Luke, I would maybe just, as a word of, I guess, caution or whatever, the things you're describing exist in pockets in the liberal West. But if you take the 8 billion people that live on this planet, how many of those people have the things you're describing, the attitudes you're describing? I'm going to guess it's a small percentage. Like,
I'll agree.
It's, you know what I mean?
I agree.
But I want to do a yes, but. So you get the rise of an abolitionist movement, which is unprecedented in the history of the world. You get people like Quakers who are not just against a particular war, they're against war in general. These are all modern innovations.
Right.
But I want to remind you, the United States, for example, banned the importation of slaves, but did not ban slavery. You could still have a natural population increase in America, and you could sell someone born into slavery. You just couldn't steal someone from Africa and bring them over. That's a different kind of law. And they passed a very unbiblical law in which a freed slave could be recaptured and had to be returned to its owner. Even within a very Christian West, the abolitionists were looked on as crazy radicals. They weren't looked as being on the frontier of the best of American culture. They were lunatics. So that's not to take away. It was new. It was an advance. I guess what I'm saying, though, is there are no simple solutions. Right? We keep struggling with, where do we locate the voice of God? Where do we locate the moral imperative? How do we work that out in a way that produces what we see as progress or advance? And it's not self-evident.
I think I hear what, to maybe summarize what you're saying in a sense, is that we want to create a narrative of history that comports with our ideas of what would be ideal, and then make that narrative work. And what you're saying is it defies that, because guess what? it's very complex,
Well, and I guess I want to say a third way, which is what I hear Luke doing is entirely admirable and I want to support. Creating a narrative is how people convey what we think matters from the past,
right.
right? The past doesn't have a pattern. It's just everything everyone did. But when you write a history book, you have to decide whether Queen Elizabeth's third course salad is as important as the role of the British Navy in India. So when you write a history, you decide what matters. And that is actually not a reflection of the time you're writing about. It's a reflection of the author and the audience and what they want to have a discussion about. So the idea of mining history for a tale that leads to a greater commitment to human dignity is entirely appropriate. It's what history always is. It's always a story told for a reason, right? So I just want to highlight that. There's an inevitably intersubjective thing that happens that turns fact into history.
Right.
I'd like to clarify that I don't want to be misconstrued as creating a narrative that's all rosy for the present day. That's not, I don't have rose-colored glasses in that sense. I recognize that there are still all kinds of problems, even with respect to slavery and equality
Of course.
Right.
in all areas. And our murderous streak is still there. We have it in us, but now we have an awareness of that streak and we are working against it in a way that
That's
society
right.
has never done before.
100%.
Right.
So murder is commonplace, but now so are humanitarian efforts. After every natural disaster, there's a major humanitarian effort. After every pandemic, we're bringing medical approaches, new medical approaches all around the globe. We're setting up, humans in general are setting up social safety nets and
Yes.
assistance programs for all kinds of basic human needs. Those are commonplace. And the other thing that's commonplace, which used to really bother me, but now having done the thinking I've done for this episode, I realize this is a good thing. What is also commonplace is protest. We have protests everywhere in the world about everything. People are squawking about everything. Protests against wars, against inequalities, against injustices of all kinds. They used to annoy me, but now I recognize this is an important thing. We need to raise the awareness and to recognize that this is innocent. I see these protests and these humanitarian efforts and these social safety nets, those reflect the human species now beginning to flex a moral and ethical muscle.
I agree 100%. I would only caution us, there is a totalitarianism of victimization also, right? There's no place to escape the challenge. So it's not only, of course, I'm a firm believer in a maximal definition of free speech, but free speech stops when you bully someone else into not being able to have the gathering they want to have, or harass a speaker and silence them. And so the challenge is, how do we nurture legitimate protest and maintain a kind of neutral process which allows different people to articulate different views and be able to engage in that kind of society-wide conversation that used to get silenced. I agree with you. That's what we're working on these days.
Yeah, let me ask this, and if it's too touchy, we can take it out, because I know right now it's a hot topic, but in this area, there's a lot of discussion these days about anti-Semitism, right? And I mean, there's clear anti-Semitism, and there's no doubt about that. And when somebody puts swastikas on synagogues, there's no doubt that's anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
However, the lines have blurred a bit because of the issue of what's going on in the Middle East, and is criticizing Israeli government policy anti-Semitism? I think it fits into what we're saying here. So if you don't mind me asking,
Look, you have to work hard to offend me.
Yeah. Okay.
Unless you intend to, then I can give you clues. You didn't come anywhere close.
Okay.
Being able to have an honest conversation isn't offensive.
Right. I hope not. No.
So I want to be very clear about a couple things. One is criticizing Israeli policy is an essential part of living in a democracy, right? The same way we criticize British policy or criticize French policy or Nepalese policy.
Yeah.
Of course, people have opinions about that. And Israel is governed by human beings. And so it deserves as much criticism as anyone else. Where I think that crosses a line is twofold. One, when criticism of Israel becomes a call for its elimination, Right? In other words, one can be very critical of American policy, how we conducted the war in Iran, how, pick the policy of your choice. But nobody says, and therefore America has to go. Right? So, but people all the time think that the conclusion to criticizing Israel is illegitimate. And that's a clear sign to me that it's crossed into something else.
Okay.
And the second place where it crosses over is it wouldn't occur to me to say to you, Scott, what's your ancestry?
Right.
And then once I know your ancestry, to say, you're Anglo-Saxon, you baby killer.
Yeah, right.
Because of something that Britain did.
Yeah.
Right. But I get that all the time.
Yeah.
And when I was in Germany, our rabbinical school is located on a public campus, the University of Potsdam, which is a magnificent public university. Only one building has police guards and locks the doors, and that's the Jewish Studies building. That suggests to me this isn't about Israel at all. It's not even about Palestinians directly, although certainly what's happening in Gaza is a tragedy. And I have my own critiques of Israel's role in that as well. But for example, the fact that people are turning it into a football game in which you have a team and your team does only what's right and the other team never do anything right, that I think is a measure of the sickness of our partisan times. And so absolutely criticism of Israel is vital for those of us who love Israel. And for people who are pissed at Israel, that's also fine. But it's not white hat, black hat. And to not criticize Hamas for what to not criticize the PA for what they've done, to not criticize the constant offering of peace, which are rejected again and again, it's a full. And so then the last thing I just want to say, and this is just my personal opinion, so you're welcome to reject it. Again, there's a long line of people who, right? I tell people all the time the following 4 points. Israel and Israelis are not going anywhere. Palestine and Palestinians are not going anywhere. There is no long-term military solution, and we will only make progress together. I think that is self-evidently true, and the rest is a distraction.
Yeah.
So
agreed.
The real divide is between those people who want to be in exclusive possession of the truth and eliminate their enemies, and those people who realize it's a messy, muddy world, and we have to find a way to live in it together.
Yeah.
But that makes me unpopular on both sides.
Yeah, well, no, I can imagine. And I totally echo what you just said into my own conversation. I happen to have a daughter who converted to Islam, which has been quite a journey in itself for me. Sure. And in my discussions with her, this is exactly what I say. It's no side is right, no side is wrong in that absolutist sense, right?
Correct.
It's just the whole thing is a mess.
Right.
And the only, just like you said, I think the only way out of this in the long run is exactly what you're saying.
Well, and I guess I want to say even further, because I have this discussion both within the Jewish community and beyond. Even if one side you want to hold is more innocent than the other side, that's fine. It just doesn't change the outcome. They're not going anywhere. We're not getting rid of Palestinians. They're not getting rid of Israelis. We're going to be sharing the land somehow. So we need to figure out a way to stop killing each other's kids. And that seems to me to be where you start a kind of, you don't keep rehashing the past. You say, all right, moving forward, what do we do about it? And that gets back to what Luke was saying. We have now tools. There have been thousands of years of tools to allow us to intervene in advancing a moral settlement. One of the keys of democracy is to create a neutral public ground in which people can have incompatible views and still sit down to lunch together, right? And if we lose that ability, which we are on the brink of losing, not just Israel, Palestine, Republicans and Democrats, President Reagan and Tip O'Neill used to drink beer together.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's going to undermine democracy as much as anything.
No, you're so right.
Okay. We're coming close to the end of our time, but there is one other thing I wanted to talk about. I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, and I have been looking forward to this. We mentioned that you are a big proponent of process theology.
Yes.
And that you yourself were keen to bring that lens onto this topic. Scott and I have previously explored open theology and process theology in episode number 90, but maybe, Brad, you should give your own brief description of it, partly as a
Sure.
reminder, but partly because you may have a slightly different perspective on it than the one we took.
Mm.
So, I kind of stumbled on process theology by accident. I was dealing with, I have a son who is autistic, and Jacob is great, and I do not think autism is a burden. I think that it's a different way of being human, or many ways of being human, but society makes it really, really difficult for people who are autistic and for people who love people who are autistic. And reckoning with that, I just realized there was no way that I thought God picked Jacob to be autistic, and that I couldn't serve such a God. And that in fact, there are countless examples in the world. If everything that exists is the clear evidence of God's will, then God is the greatest underachiever in the universe. And I just don't believe that. I believe that creaturely freedom also has a role. And so what process theology teaches in essence is that God and people are all on the way towards becoming. And that being is a logical abstraction. Everything is actually becoming. And God is becoming no less than God's creation, and that anyone who's created anything knows that what you create ends up having its own integrity. So God works in, with, and through all of creation, but creation has a voice in which future becomes real. And that God gives us the power to make the optimal choices to bring about the best possible future. That process people call the lure. And the lure is optimal in terms of love, justice, experience, and relationship. But in that, God plants within us an intuition of what that is, and then the power to help bring it about within the constraints we find ourselves. And that for me was really liberating. Some people are terrified by it because they'd rather have a world in which everything is certain, even if it's false. But to me, what it allows, I'll tell you, my son Jacob, when he first heard me talking about process thought, he said, well, that means God didn't want me to have autism. And I said, that's right. And he said, that means God doesn't hate me. That's for sure right. And that God is working with you at every moment. My son Jacob, armed with that insight and an indefatigable mom, is now working on his high school equivalency at the age of 30, which his doctor said he would never be able to do. And I say to him again and again, you and God are creating the kind of miracle that they can't replicate on a movie studio.
Yeah.
Right? It's not special effects. So that's what process is really about in its essence.
Wow. Who in particular, any thinkers in particular that have influenced you in all that, or that you found very
many. What I will say in praise of process theology is, there are some thinkers who you love them in their writing, and then you meet them in person and realize that the person is nothing like the written character. But I will tell you that my process friends, Catherine Keller, John Cobb, Jay Michelson, Jay McDaniels, these people are fine human beings who have welcomed me in. And that to me is further vindication of the process of process. Like, these are really people who live the teachings and walk the walk.
I certainly recognize John Cobb. I mean, he's one of the real leading figure in the process.
He is indeed. And if you've never read Catherine Keller, you have a treat in store for you.
Okay.
Perhaps one last theological question. This was in case we had time. And do we have another 5 minutes?
For me, we do.
Okay, all right. So we did allude to this earlier in the conversation, but we didn't explore this to the degree that I wanted to. So this idea, the phrase "the image of God," that the book that Jews call Bereshit and we Christians call Genesis, describes humans as being created in the image of God.
Yes.
And there's different interpretations of what that phrase means. The Hellenic Greeks, of course, applied it to the way our brain works, intellect and reason and emotions. But I understand the more ancient Hebrew interpretation of that phrase points to humans being created as God's representatives on earth, his ambassadors.
So look, the Bible itself, when it says B'Tselem Elohim, doesn't define the terms, which in a way is the Bible then inviting us to fill in the blank. So what I will say is that I take as my cue, the Bible says that the seat of what we would call intellect is the lev, the heart, which is also the seat of emotions. So the Hebrew Bible's great insight reflected in contemporary neurobiology is that thinking and feeling are not two separate processes. They're actually one interconnected process. And that to the extent that we are godlike, we are able to think, feel our way towards a better tomorrow. And that's what makes us godlike in God's image. It also means that we are then God's stewards for the rest of creation. It is
Right.
our responsibility to care for and honor and to highlight the godlike nature of creation as a whole and to elevate that in each other.
So where I was going with the idea then was that God created these ambassadors, these humans, with the ability to develop technologies that would enable them to take care of the planet. And so I have this image in my mind of a humorous image of God basically leaving the humans on the beach and saying, take care of the planet, kids, and get along. Yeah. And it's up to us to learn how to get along and develop technologies that allow this insignificant species to now dominate the planet and care for the planet and each other. Is that consistent with a Hebrew interpretation of that whole story?
Absolutely. And I guess the challenge that it lays out for us, is that the Hebrew Bible and Judaism following it does not see people as primarily evil or primarily good. It sees us as having two impulses, a good impulse and an evil impulse. And that means it's up to us to choose the good and to strengthen the good. So our technology has provided many blessings, not least this conversation. But it has also brought us to the brink of planetary destruction. And so all of that is none of it is inevitable. As the Torah wisely says, Uvacharta b'chaim, you should choose life. And you don't tell people that if the choice is simple. You tell them that because it's actually really hard to choose life.
I'm working through this idea that God created humans, that he didn't create ready-to-go humans. Humans evolved through a very long biological process. We've been evolving biologically and cognitively, theologically, religiously. And today I wanted to address this whole idea that we've also been evolving morally. And I do believe that we have been, and getting ready to be representatives on this planet on behalf of Elohim.
Well, I hope you're right. I do tell Molly, my dog, that we are not what she thinks we are.
Yes. Okay. Brad, before we go, do you want to make any kind of a closing statement or a summary, a take-home message of any kind?
Yeah, I want to celebrate you guys. I really believe that salvation will come about when we give God the gift of loving each other more and of listening to each other. Conversations like these are not for me entertainment. They're the very work of salvation, because I think that God can only flourish in a space of mutual love and respect. So I just want to thank you for this holy work and for letting me be part of it today.
Yeah, we're exceptionally grateful for the time that you have given us and your insight and your immense expertise on this. I enjoyed this. I learned a lot from you. Thank you very much, Brad.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I look forward to future conversations.
Me too.
All the best.
Take care.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
Okay.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.